Every great mystery begins quietly. Not with a scream in the night, but with something so ordinary it almost slips past unnoticed. In this case, it was a land survey. April 14, 2003. A team from the West Virginia Geological and Economic Survey was out in the Appalachian backcountry, mapping terrain for a logging proposal. The area was remote, the kind of wild, endless green that seems untouched by time. No towns nearby. No cell service. Just ridgelines, the hum of insects, and the low mechanical pulse of their radar scanner cutting through the soil. They expected rocks. Maybe a few old mine shafts. What they found instead was an echo of the dead. On the screen, faint outlines began to appear. Uniform, rectangular voids in the earth. Too regular to be natural. At first, they thought it was an abandoned graveyard, maybe from a pioneer settlement. But when they cross-checked the records, nothing came up. No town, no church, no burial permits, nothing. So the team returned with archaeologists. They marked the site, carefully unearthed the first grave, and the strangeness deepened. There was no coffin, just bones, wrapped in decomposed fabric. And where a headstone should have been, there was only a rough fieldstone, etched crudely with a circle and a single in its center. Not a Christian cross. Not any symbol in their reference guides. 87 graves in total. 62 of them belonged to children under 10. Imagine that for a moment. An entire hidden cemetery of children, buried in silence, miles from civilization. No records of disease, no epidemic, no disaster reported in the region between 1885 and 1905. Just gone. When the report was filed, File 7B44, it barely made a ripple. Bureaucracy buries anomalies every day. But one curious analyst noticed something. The coordinates of the site lined up perfectly with an old land grant issued to a family name that had all but vanished from history. That name was Blackridge. Digging through the archives, the researcher found a few fragments, a mining company charter, a town map labeled Blackridge Hollow, and a faded photograph of a stern-faced man with burning eyes. The caption read, Hezekiah Blackridge, founder and benefactor, 1889. The more they looked, the stranger it got. The town itself had disappeared, erased from official maps by 1910. No census entries, no property transfers, not even death certificates for the people who supposedly lived there. But the land, the graves, the symbols, they were real. And that discovery lit the fuse on a story buried for more than a century. Because what started as a footnote in a geological report would soon unravel into one of the most chilling chapters in Appalachian history, the story of a family whose power turned faith into tyranny and science into something unspeakable. Before the graves, before the silence, there was a man. And his name carried weight like scripture. Hezekiah Blackridge. In the late 1800s, when the Appalachian valleys were still clawing their way out of poverty, Hezekiah appeared like a savior. A self-made industrialist with the voice of a preacher and the ambition of a monarch. He arrived in Boone County in 1879 with investors, machinery, and a promise: steady work, good pay, and moral order in a world that seemed to be falling apart. He founded the Blackridge mining concern, and overnight, the valley transformed. Roads carved through the forest. Rail lines snaked into the hills. A company town rose from the mud, Blackridge Hollow. At first glance, it was paradise. A place where every man had a job, every family had a home, and every Sunday was spent under the vaulted ceiling of the New Covenant Church, listening to Hezekiah thunder from the pulpit about purity, discipline, and divine purpose. But beneath that polished veneer was something colder, a design. See, Hezekiah didn't pay his workers in US dollars. He created his own private currency, Blackridge script, which could only be spent at the company store. Everything from food to clothing to rent was owned by him. The people worked, slept, prayed, and died under his control. It wasn't a town. It was a closed system, a human experiment in loyalty and dependence. And yet, the workers revered him. They called him Father Hezekiah. He gave sermons about the dangers of outside influence, alcohol, gambling, idleness, sin. He claimed that the hollow was sacred ground, protected from the moral rot of modern society. And his wife, Era Blackridge, played the role of the saintly matron, distributing blankets in winter, running the Sunday school, comforting widows with soft words and colder eyes. To outsiders, the Blackridges were model Christians, the kind of family newspapers loved to photograph beside charity banners and church drives. But inside the hollow, obedience wasn't a virtue. It was law. Every house had rules. Every family was expected to report sickness, disputes, and even dreams that strayed from the covenant of purity. The Blackridge guards, called wardens, patrolled the streets at night to ensure peace, though peace under surveillance is just another kind of prison. Still, no one rebelled. Why would they? Their lives, their livelihoods, even their faith, were inseparable from Hezekiah's vision. And from the outside, it worked. Productivity soared. The company grew. Hezekiah was praised in business circles as a genius of management, a pioneer of moral industry. But control, real control, always demands sacrifice. And somewhere beneath those tidy rows of identical houses, beneath the hymns and smiling faces, Hezekiah had already begun testing how far that control could go. Because in Blackridge Hollow, obedience wasn't just expected. It was engineered. Every empire has a law. For Rome, it was written on stone. For Blackridge Hollow, it was etched in fear. The people called it the Covenant. Officially, it was a moral charter, a list of community standards designed, as Hezekiah claimed, to preserve purity and order. But in truth, it was something far more insidious, a blueprint for domination. The Covenant dictated everything. It forbade alcohol, gambling, and profanity, nothing unusual for the time. But read closer, and the rules grew peculiar. Children weren't allowed near the East Creek after dusk. No one could keep pets. All medical concerns, no matter how minor, had to be reported directly to the patriarch's office. Then there was the most unsettling section, the wellness tithe. Each week, every family had to undergo a health inspection conducted jointly by Hezekiah and the town physician. On paper, it was about disease prevention, a noble idea in a mining community prone to accidents and illness. But for those who lived through it, the ritual was humiliating. Families stood in their kitchens as Hezekiah and his assistants took notes, measuring not just their bodies, but their behavior. Who looked tired? Who looked weak? Whose children were coughing too much? And everything, every detail, was recorded in a massive ledger kept in his private office. Over time, the covenant became more than a code. It became gospel. Hezekiah preached that God had chosen Blackridge Hollow as a crucible of purity, a place to refine humanity from its imperfections. He told his congregation that illness was not a curse, but a test, and that the faithful must trust his judgment in deciding who is worthy of healing. Those who obeyed prospered. Those who questioned vanished. A miner's wife might fall ill and be taken for treatment at the manor, never to be seen again. A child might disobey the Sabbath and suddenly relocate to a boarding school no one could name. No one dared ask questions. Fear became its own kind of faith. And through it all, Hezekiah's sermons grew darker, more apocalyptic. He warned that corruption came not from outside, but from within. He said weakness was inherited, and that to protect the community, the unfit must be purified. People nodded. They prayed. They believed him. Because to doubt Hezekiah was to doubt God himself. It's chilling when you think about it, how easily faith can be twisted when control wears the mask of salvation. And yet, for years, no one challenged him. No one dared, until a stranger arrived. A young doctor from Boston, armed with science, logic, and an innocence that wouldn't last. His name was Elias Thorne, and he was about to learn that in Blackridge Hollow, the sickness didn't come from the mines. It came from the pulpit. When Dr. Elias Thorne arrived in Blackridge Hollow in the spring of 1888, he was just 27, fresh from medical school in Boston, with sharp eyes, steady hands, and an unshakable faith in reason. He'd been hired directly by Hezekiah Blackridge himself to serve as the town's physician, an honor, he was told, and a blessing from God. Elias had heard of industrial company towns before, but nothing like this. From the moment he stepped off the carriage, Blackridge Hollow felt different. The streets were immaculate. Children in crisp uniforms walked to school in silence. Men tipped their hats politely, but avoided eye contact. And on the hill above it all, like a sentinel watching over his flock, stood the Blackridge Manor, a grand, gray structure that seemed to absorb the light around it. At first, Elias was impressed. The town was efficient, peaceful, almost utopian. Hezekiah greeted him warmly, a tall man with silver hair and the kind of charisma that filled a room. His wife, Era, was quiet but commanding, her words measured, her smiles rehearsed. Elias believed he'd found the rarest thing, a community that truly cared for its people. But it didn't take long for small cracks to appear. His first patient was an 8-year-old boy named Samuel Miller, the son of a mine foreman. Scarlet fever, serious, but treatable. Elias prescribed rest and medication, and the boy began to improve. Then, during that week's wellness tithe, Era Blackridge arrived at the Miller's home. She dismissed Elias's treatment, claiming the family needed spiritual healing. 2 days later, Samuel was dead. Elias was devastated. But what unsettled him most wasn't the loss, it was the town's reaction. There was grief, yes, but beneath it something else. Acceptance. Samuel's parents even thanked Hezekiah for his guidance in their time of trial. It didn't make sense. That night, Elias wrote in his journal, "They speak of death as if it were mercy. There is sickness here beyond the physical." He tried to shake the feeling. After all, he was an outsider. What did he know of their customs? But as weeks turned into months, more oddities surfaced. Medical records vanished. Children missed appointments. Whole families moved away overnight without notice. And every time, Hezekiah had an explanation. He called it divine will. Elias began noticing patterns, whispers of special inspections, symbols carved on certain doorframes, and a growing unease that the town's perfection was maintained through invisible means. He told himself he was imagining things, that he was exhausted, overworked, paranoid. But then one evening, he stumbled upon something he wasn't supposed to see, a massive leather-bound ledger in Hezekiah's office, the master tithe record, filled with strange red markings beside each family's name. Circles, squares, triangles. They weren't random. They meant something. And from that moment on, Elias Thorne's curiosity became his curse. Elias Thorne couldn't stop thinking about that book. The master tithe ledger sat on Hezekiah's desk like an altar, thick, worn, and ominously precise. Inside, every family in Blackridge Hollow was listed in perfect rows, as if their lives were just entries in a divine account. Next to each name, Hezekiah had drawn tiny red symbols, circles, squares, triangles. No explanations. No legends. Just silent codes written in a man's steady hand. At first, Elias thought it was some kind of bookkeeping shorthand, perhaps to track supplies or attendance. But when he began comparing dates with his own medical notes, a darker pattern emerged. Families marked with a red circle reported a child's illness within days. A square preceded an accident in the mines. A triangle often came before someone simply disappeared. Coincidence? He wanted to believe so. But the precision was uncanny. The patterns repeated, week after week, like clockwork. Elias began copying what he could into his own notebook. He worked late into the night, candlelight flickering across pages filled with dread. The more he compared, the more undeniable it became. The ledger didn't just record tragedy. It predicted it. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe Hezekiah was just recording divine visions, or local gossip. Maybe he was superstitious. But no, this was systematic, clinical, calculated. And Elias wasn't the only one who knew. During one of the wellness tithes, he noticed something subtle. The way Era Blackridge would glance at a child, take their wrist in her hand, and pause just long enough to make a mental note. Later that week, Elias would find that same family marked with a new symbol in the ledger. She was part of it, maybe even the one assigning the marks. Elias's growing fear wasn't just for the townspeople, it was for himself. He began asking quiet questions, noticing the way conversations would stop when he entered a room, the way wardens now lingered outside his office longer than necessary. The isolation was crushing. He turned to one of the few people who seemed unafraid to speak, Martha, the town's aging midwife. She delivered nearly every child in Blackridge Hollow and carried herself with the weight of someone who'd seen too much. When Elias confided his suspicions, she didn't gasp or dismiss him. She just looked at him with tired eyes and said, "You've seen the marks then." That's when she told him about the quiet room, a locked cellar in the Blackridge manor where sick or unruly children were sometimes taken to recover. None ever returned. Elias wanted to deny it, but deep down, he knew the pattern pointed there all along. Whatever Hezekiah was doing, whatever experiment he'd built under the veil of scripture, the ledger wasn't just documentation. It was a map of chosen victims. And the quiet room was where the pattern ended. The human mind has a way of dismissing what it can't comprehend. Elias Thorne tried, he tried, to convince himself that Martha's story was just rumor. Some ghost tale to scare newcomers. But once you start pulling at a thread like that, it doesn't stop. It tightens. And on a gray Sunday morning, with Hezekiah's booming sermon echoing through the valley, Elias decided to pull harder. He knew the manor would be nearly empty during services. Era always sat in the front pew, head bowed, her gloved hands folded like porcelain. Hezekiah's voice could be heard for miles. That meant Elias had 3 hours, no more. Using a master key borrowed from a sympathetic groundskeeper, he slipped through the servants' entrance. The corridors were eerily silent, filled with the heavy scent of oil and polished wood. The house seemed to listen as he moved. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a confession. He found the study first, a fortress of order. Ledger books lined the shelves, each one meticulously labeled. But the one that mattered, Hezekiah's private ledger, was missing. Then Elias noticed something strange. A copy of Darwin's On the Origin of Species sat slightly out of place. He pulled it. The bookshelf clicked. A hidden panel swung open. Inside was a single black leather volume, unmarked, ominous, and heavy. What Elias found inside chilled him to his core. It wasn't a diary. It wasn't a sermon. It was a scientific log, filled with cold, clinical notes about subjects, traits, and experimental observations. Hezekiah Blackridge, the preacher of purity, had been running an experiment in human breeding. He saw the miners and their families as imperfect stock, a population to be studied, purified, and controlled. The covenant, the wellness tithe, the rules about children playing near the creek, all of it was part of his deranged project. He believed weakness was hereditary, that sickness, disobedience, even moral failure could be traced through bloodlines. And his solution? To prune the unfit before their flaws could spread. The quiet room wasn't a place of healing. It was a chamber of observation, where children deemed defective were left to die under the guise of divine judgment. Elias read entry after entry, his hands trembling. He saw names he recognized, Samuel Miller, the boy who died in his care. And beside that name a note. Termination complete. Line ended. He slammed the book shut, bile rising in his throat. For a long moment, he just stood there, the weight of centuries of sin pressing down on him. Then he knew he had to escape. He had to get that ledger out and show the world what Hezekiah had done. But as he turned toward the door, a voice cut through the silence.
Soft. Calm.
You shouldn't be here, Doctor. Era Blackridge stood in the doorway, her expression serene and utterly without pity. For a heartbeat, Elias Thorne couldn't move. Era Blackridge's calm gaze froze him where he stood, the black ledger clutched in his hands like a stolen soul. She didn't scream. She didn't lunge. She simply closed the door behind her and said, almost kindly, "You've seen what was never meant for you." Her voice carried the softness of a prayer and the certainty of a judge. Elias realized, in that moment, that this woman, quiet, graceful Era, was no passive accomplice. She was the enforcer, the keeper of her husband's gospel of purity. He took a step back, trying to speak to reason. "You're killing them," he said. "Children, your people. You call this divine?" Era's smile didn't waver. "We call it cleansing," she whispered. "Hezekiah is removing corruption before it spreads. You, of all people, should understand the science of it." That word, science, twisted his stomach. This wasn't faith. It was fanaticism dressed in the language of logic. When she moved closer, Elias acted on instinct. He pushed past her, sprinting into the corridor as her voice echoed after him, calm but sharp. "Everyone answers for their trespass, Doctor." He didn't stop. Through the manor's maze-like halls, down the servant stairs, through the kitchen, he ran. Every creak felt like thunder in the still air. At any moment, he expected to hear the warden's boots. But somehow, miraculously, he made it outside. The morning light felt blinding. He cut across the yard, hiding the ledger under his coat. From the church on the hill, Hezekiah's sermon carried like rolling thunder. The valley itself seemed to listen. Elias ducked into the woods, following the narrow path toward the old supply road. For hours he walked, stumbled, hid. Every shadow felt alive. By nightfall, he reached the river crossing. There, half buried under moss, he found one of the old mining carts, abandoned, its tracks leading out toward the ridge. He climbed inside and waited, shaking, the ledger pressed to his chest. In those hours of silence, as the forest whispered around him, Elias realized what he had truly stolen. Not just evidence, but proof of an ideology. A glimpse into the darkest corner of the human mind, where belief and biology had fused into horror. By dawn, he reached a small trading post beyond the valley. From there, he made his way to Charleston, to the state authorities. He turned over the ledger, the records, everything. Hezekiah's sanctuary of purity was about to be exposed. But even as Elias walked into the courthouse, exhausted and hollow-eyed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That Hezekiah had seen all of this coming. Because men who build worlds of control rarely lose without a fight. And Blackridge Hollow was about to learn that exposing a monster doesn't mean the monster dies. When the story of Blackridge Hollow finally reached Charleston, it sounded too grotesque to be real. A preacher industrialist turned eugenicist? A hidden graveyard of children? A ledger that read like the diary of a god complex? The officials who first read Elias Thorne's report dismissed it outright, until the ledger itself landed on their desks. Its pages didn't preach. They documented dates, measurements, names, entries written with the precision of a scientist and the detachment of a man dissecting souls. By the summer of 1891, the investigation had become a sensation. Newspapers printed fragments of the story, calling Hezekiah Blackridge the shepherd of death. Reporters flooded the county. For the first time, the outside world looked directly into the valley's darkness, and the world recoiled. Hezekiah was arrested at his manor. Era, standing by the door, handed him his hat before he was taken away. No tears, no panic, just quiet grace, like a queen seeing her king off to war. The trial that followed should have been the moment justice roared. But what came instead was a whisper. Hezekiah's wealth had built more than a town. It had built connections. Business partners from New York and Philadelphia financed a defense team that turned the courtroom into theater. They painted Hezekiah as a misunderstood visionary, a pious man burdened by leadership. Elias, meanwhile, was portrayed as an ungrateful employee, a bitter atheist fabricating scandal to destroy a man of faith. And the jury? 12 local men, most of whom had once worked for the Blackridge mining concern. The prosecution had the ledger, yes, but its horror worked against them. The details were so monstrous, so unimaginable, that people refused to believe a man of God could write them. One juror later confessed that they thought it had to be fiction. The verdict? Not guilty of murder. Not guilty of conspiracy. Just one minor conviction, criminal negligence and practicing medicine without a license. 5 years in a state asylum. Hezekiah served less than 3. Era was never charged. The Blackridge business partners were never named. The records that tied them to the mining operations were quietly sealed for national economic interests. And Elias? The whistleblower, the man who had risked everything, he was ruined. His testimony had been ridiculed, his reputation shredded. No hospital would hire him. He spent his final years running a free clinic for the poor in Baltimore, haunted by every child's cough, every fever that reminded him of Samuel Miller. Justice didn't just fail. It folded. Hezekiah lived long enough to see his name slowly vanish from the papers. When he finally died, his obituary was 3 sentences long. But the system that protected him, that had enabled his experiment, never faced trial. And in that silence, the seeds of his legacy remained buried, waiting.
G.
After the trial, Blackridge Hollow didn't die all at once. It withered, slowly, quietly, like a body drained of blood. When Hezekiah returned from the asylum, the mines were already closing. Investors had pulled out, the workers had scattered, and the once proud town began to rot from the edges inward. Houses stood empty, their windows staring blankly over the valley. The church bell stopped ringing. The company's store shuttered its doors. Within a decade, Blackridge Hollow was a ghost town. But if you spoke to the locals, the few who still lived near the ridge, they'd tell you it was never truly abandoned. They'd say lights still flickered in the manor on certain nights. That the sound of hymns could sometimes be heard drifting through the trees, faint and dissonant, like a choir rehearsing for no one. And in the woods, where the surveyors had once found that unmarked cemetery, the earth began to sink, as if the graves themselves were exhaling. The state archives eventually boxed away what little evidence remained. The ledger, the trial documents, the family records, all sealed under century-old court orders to protect the descendants and the integrity of ongoing industrial assets. A bureaucratic way of saying, some truths are too costly to unearth. Then, in the 1920s, the most important artifact, Hezekiah's ledger, vanished from the state archives. No theft report, no explanation, just gone. Some said it was destroyed. Others whispered that it was purchased by a private collector or that the government took it, not to hide the past, but to study it. Whatever the truth, it never surfaced again. The hollow itself returned to the earth. Ivy consumed the manor's walls. The wooden beams of the church collapsed under the weight of silence. But for decades afterward, hikers claimed to see strange symbols carved into the stones, circles with it in the center, half buried under moss. The same mark found on the children's graves. Historians who tried to investigate the case found their paths blocked by missing records, corrupted files, and dead ends. Some believed it was incompetence. Others thought it was deliberate. And maybe that's the cruelest part of all, how horror fades, not because it's forgotten, but because it's edited. Hezekiah's experiment wasn't erased overnight. It was absorbed by institutions, by silence, by the polite indifference of people who decided it was easier not to look. But every now and then, an old map resurfaces. A letter, a newspaper clipping. And when it does, so does the question. Was Blackridge Hollow just one man's madness, or the first chapter in something larger? A prototype of an idea too horrifying to die. The valley still holds its breath. And some nights, if the wind is right, they say you can hear the faint echo of a sermon carried through the trees, preaching purity to an empty congregation. Time has a way of softening stories, turning monsters into myths and atrocities into legends. But some histories resist decay. They live on, not in textbooks or museums, but in the quiet places, the sealed archives, the missing pages, the whispers between those who dare to ask the wrong questions. And the story of Hezekiah Blackridge is one of them. Today, nothing remains of Blackridge Hollow except a scattering of foundations beneath a forest canopy. The old mining tunnels have caved in. The manor is little more than rubble. But every so often, someone stumbles onto the past, a fragment of pottery, a rusted piece of mining script, a child's shoe half buried in clay. And when they do, the same feeling returns, a shiver, as though the ground itself remembers. In 2003, that shiver became a headline again. The discovery of the children's graves, 87 unmarked burials, reopened wounds no one had expected to feel. It reignited questions historians had stopped asking. Who funded Hezekiah's mining company? Who protected him during the trial? And, most disturbingly, why were so many of his personal writings locked away for over a century? Some researchers suggest that the Blackridge experiment was never isolated, that it may have influenced early 20th century eugenic movements in the United States and Europe. The timing fits. The language in the surviving ledger excerpts, words like purification, removal of recessive traits, and selective advancement, echo phrases found decades later in academic papers and government reports. Coincidence? Maybe. But coincidences have a way of clustering around the truth. Others think the Blackridge experiment never really ended, that it simply evolved, shifting from isolated valleys to corporate boardrooms, medical institutions, and social programs cloaked in benevolent language. Hezekiah's dream of controlling purity, of deciding who deserves to thrive, may have just taken on a more modern vocabulary. We may never know for sure. The official records remain sealed. The ledger is still missing. And the land itself, the hills that once echoed with hymns, has gone quiet again. But history leaves fingerprints. Every discovery, every half-buried truth, is another reminder that progress is not always forward, and that some ideologies, once planted, grow deep roots. So when we talk about forgotten evils, about towns erased from maps and ledgers locked away in state archives, we have to ask ourselves, what else have we chosen not to see? Because the real horror of the Blackridge story isn't just what Hezekiah did. It's how easily he was allowed to do it. And how, even now, the earth above those unmarked graves still feels heavier than it should. This is the legacy of Blackridge Hollow, a warning whispered through the centuries. When faith and power blur their boundaries, the line between salvation and slaughter disappears. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying truth of all.